Hey folks, so this is officially our last lesson and our last video lecture for the whole course. And then after this, you'll be focusing on the final 30%. So here we go. Just to answer a couple questions about the final 30% before we talk about the Black Death. So I've had some questions about the weighting of that, and basically it's 15%, 15%. In the pilot project, we were talking about playing around with weightings and the possibility of no exam, blah, blah, blah. Final word, though, was kind of yes, that we have to do both, at least this time around, and that it'll be 15 and 15%. So next week on Monday, I'll probably post another awkward video of myself talking about the final 30 performance task options, and then your exam is the other 15% of that final 30%. But as I said in the exam video, really it is very straightforward. It's very opinion based. It's very centered around you using your learning from the course, but also your knowledge of historical thinking concepts and historical judgments and evidence usage, all of that kind of thing. So it is meant to be easy and reflective. You've got 2 hours to do it, or longer if you have an IEP, and really I feel like it will not take you probably anywhere close to that long. So yeah, keep emailing me if you have questions about that, but let's move on to the Black Death. So I've posted a link to this video, this kind of creepy world 4-minute little video on your handout if you're following along with the handout. You might want to go back and watch that. You maybe have heard the idea that the nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is connected to the Black Death, and certainly there's a lot of speculation about that being true. So go back and watch that video kind of as an introduction. When we're talking about the plague, we are talking about a mass European plague. Depending on the area, we're looking at about 35 to 70% mortality rate, about 25 million people dead in Europe in a very short period of time, 1347 to 1351. That's not very long. There are higher reports, but most estimates show about 1/3 of the European population at the time dies. And it does originate in Asia. You can kind of see in this map where it goes, and we'll talk a little bit about that first landing point, and then it spreads very quickly along those travel routes. One of the reasons that the plague is able to take over so quickly and so easily is that there's a famine about 30 years earlier. The Europeans, with that manorial system, really were, through the village life, through peasants and serfs, using all of the land, or the vast majority of the land that was able to be cultivated at the time. When you've got a big climate change then, so you've got a big drop, you've got excessive rains, a lot of things going on between 1315 and 1317, you then have a lot of resulting crop failures. About 15% of the peasants in some villages die, which is a fairly large number. And really, for the people who didn't die, there were still really big consequences. People were starving, people were in poverty, of course, if you're a farmer and you're trying to make a living off of your harvests. But the other big thing was that it made people very susceptible to disease. And if you were looking at life in the medieval village, depending on which topics you chose to cover and examine and summarize, you might have come across that idea that health and sanitation was not really high on the list of things that the medieval village cared about. Houses were very close together. They didn't have that kind of sewage system and water system that the Romans had. Really, you're looking at a time period where all of those sorts of things have been, at least in Europe, have been kind of forgotten about and discarded, and you're really focusing around religion. So, sorry, my daughter's in the bath and she's going crazy. So you've got, I'm losing my train of thought. Because of that, it really is this time period where villages, it's very easy for disease to spread in them. You've got a lot of people in very close quarters. Again, because they don't care a lot about sanitation, things are already dirty and gross, and there's feces in the street and all of that kind of stuff. So spread of disease, regardless of the Black Plague or not, was very common and very easy. In terms of the plague itself, it kind of originates in Sicily, so off that little island off the tip of the Italian boot peninsula there. You've basically got trading ships that dock in Sicily in about 1347 in October, and everyone on the ship is either dead or dying. I don't know if you can hear my daughter, but she's losing her mind. Very distracting. They're all either dead or dying. And so the people in Sicily obviously notice this, and they're like, bye, we don't want you here, please go away. Everyone on the ship, you've got fever, pain, nausea, diarrhea. People are covered in black boils that are basically oozing pus and blood. So they kind of look at these as death ships, and they say, like, get out of the harbor, go back where you came from, we don't want whatever you've got. But at that point, it was already too late. And again, because of the things we just talked about with the famine, with the increased susceptibility to disease, really, it was just too late for it. And the disease spreads very, very quickly across the trade routes. And you've got here a list of the major areas that it hits. But you're really looking at, if you look at this map, the spread of the disease in terms of what's happening. Again, we come this way from Asia down to Sicily. And then you really have the spread going from south, so these southern areas, north in Europe, and you've also got the spread from the east into the west. So this whole area here, and someone had the question in my class, why was this gray area not affected? I really don't know. That's a great question, but I have no idea what the answer to it is. But so you've got the spread of the disease all over this area. So this is what you're really looking at with the Black Death, and that 1/3 of the population being essentially killed off with this. The next slide has some gross images, just heads up. The symptoms of the plague, as I said, fever, headache, aching joints, nothing that immediately is going to throw you off and think that something really bad is happening. But then it's accompanied by vomiting blood, very painful lymph nodes, and they would collect themselves usually in the warm places of your body, kind of armpits, groin areas. You can see these big, like, boil-like things rising up under the skin. They could be oozing pus, oozing blood. It would be a lot of damage to the skin. The reason it was called the Black Death, as you can see here, is that it would quite literally turn your skin black. Those really dark, dark blotches. These boils could burst, and it was said that that was actually a good thing because it gave you a better chance of survival if it burst on its own, but otherwise it would just swell with that pus beneath the skin, and you could very easily die. Primary source evidence that we have of this one's from 1411. You can see though in these drawings, these people covered with those boils. You can see here an example of lancing one of those boils off, or trying to kind of lance it to sort of let the blood out, that idea of kind of bloodletting. And you've also got, in this picture, if you take a look at what's going on and think about who these guys are and who these guys are, this message about the plague really does reflect the religious nature of the era that we are looking at here. There was a lot of explanation that was very religious in nature, in terms of, we are being punished, this is a disease sent by the devil, obviously we've done something wrong, we haven't been good enough, yada yada yada. And essentially that's why everyone was dying. So this is a big message at the time. And you do, in artistic works, have this increased artwork of death. You've got increased literature about death because it is surrounding the Europeans during these years of the plague. This is a quote from a Florentine writer. I'm not going to read it, but you can pause and kind of read it, that essentially talks about carrying the bodies and burying them in deep pits and then covering them with dirt, making almost like a lasagna. And of course, a Florentine writer, very funny, kind of makes that connection. But this is another primary source from the time that just shows you how common death really was, that a Florentine writer just kind of makes the similarity between, well, you know, these pits of the dead people being like lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese. In terms of the cycle of the plague, it does come from fleas that drink the blood of infected rats and then essentially multiply, their guts clog with bacteria, they might bite a human then, and then the humans are infected. Now again, because you've got this disease coming from the east, and it is a rat, essentially like a rat disease, or a disease that's been carried or created by rats, you then do have this association between, in the Western world, the negative connotations of the East and this like dirtiness and disease and rats. And so you do have in the West some kind of racism going on connected to this. So how were they trying to stop the plague? Well, they try in a few different ways. They try to quarantine people. It doesn't work very well because, again, you're living in very close quarters. This disease spreads very, very quickly, but they tried quarantining. You also have doctor's robes, and I'll show you this picture here. And if you watched that first video, you would have seen these doctor's robes in that video. But essentially, they would cover themselves in these long black robes, trying to protect themselves from the plague if they were treating people. They would, in the ends of these beaks, then stuff incense and certain herbs and scents, because they believed that one of the things that kept the plague away was certain smells. So they would fill that with those specific scents and herbs. Why they have a cape and a hat, not too sure, just maybe adds to the cool look of the doctor's robes, but definitely a very iconic, interesting look for this time period. You also had leeching, so quite literally the idea of putting leeches on the skin and trying to get them to sort of suck the plague out of you. As I said, scents, aromatic oils, this idea that those things could ward off or cure the plague. Because this is, again, very connected to religion in terms of ideology of the people at the time at least, some of them believed as well that certain sounds could keep the plague away. So the ringing of church bells was very common in villages, just constant church bell ringing to try and keep the plague away, or cannons going off to keep the plague away. People would also carry talismans around with them to try and keep the plague away. None of these things obviously worked, but people had a lot of different ideas about what could happen. You also had people that were and this was an extreme sort of religious angle here, but you have self-flagellation. So people literally walking around the streets, hurting themselves, whipping themselves to try and punish themselves so the plague didn't punish them. You also have a lot of racism against the Jewish population. Not that that's a race, but against the Jewish population. They were required to wear something called kind of like a Jew hat. If you look at this image here, essentially it's like a funnel on the head and golden circle badges to denote that they were Jewish. Kind of reminiscent of World War II, right? With Hitler. Certainly the Jewish population has been persecuted for centuries and centuries. It didn't happen first in World War II. It is a very common thing to use the Jewish population as a scapegoat. So certainly that happens again here with the Black Plague. Consequences of the plague then, when it finally does die off, when it does slow down and people stop dying from the plague, obviously huge depopulation, shifting social structures as a result of that, because you maybe have masses of peasants and serfs who have died. So you've got a different social structure going on. Persecution of minority groups, like we just looked at. Lots of peasant uprisings, people unhappy that lords and ladies were not helping them more, that the king was not helping them more, that the church maybe was not helping them more. So you've got lots of peasant uprisings, a lot of cynicism about religion and what religion could or could not do. Morbid culture shift, we already looked at those kind of skeleton artwork pieces, and economic downturn, of course. All of this stuff is going to lead directly in, if you're taking world history in grade 12, to some of those things that then happen during the next time period. What I want you to do now is I want you to take a look at the medieval MD stuff and some of the other cures that were happening in this time of not very progressive medicine. So use the links provided, and that's it.